When we landed at New York City in the afternoon of March 23rd, 1972, we'd only been gone a couple of hours from Chicago. Rachel, who was just a little over 4 years old, looked out the window at the city beneath us as we approached the airport, and she made the understatement of the day. Thinking it was Chicago, she said, "We just went up for a ride." No, Rachel. Little did she know that our life-changing ride had only just begun, and it wouldn't end with a 9-hour flight to Rio de Janeiro and the hour-long connecting flight to São Paulo, where we landed nearly 24 hours after leaving Chicago. The skyline of São Paulo's skyscrapers rivaled that of New York's, but after spending almost 24 hours traveling, even Rachel knew we hadn't just gone up for a ride. In obedience to God's call, we were excited to finally arrive in Brazil, where we would spend the rest of our lives, which we did for 3 years before God revealed the mission field He really had in mind for us, Madeira Island, a place we had never even heard of. 3 years and 3 months later, we would pass through the São Paulo airport again, leaving Brazil behind for good, headed for the U.S. and eventually to Portugal. As we landed in São Paulo, we hadn't the faintest clue that Brazil was only the training camp for our work in Madeira Island, where we were to spend the rest of our lives, this time for 40 years. And Madeira was the schooling that prepared us for service here in Arkansas, where we're once again spending the rest of our lives working for the Lord. For how long this time? Duration yet unknown. Truthfully, we have no clue how many other places where God could call us to spend the rest of our lives. We've been spending the rest of our lives serving Him since the day He called us, and each of these locations is part of the preparation for our eternal assignments in the kingdom Jesus will set up on earth when He returns. There, we will indeed spend the rest of our lives serving and worshiping Him eternally. We've only just begun. Again, as I'm writing the story of 1972, I consulted the journal that I faithfully kept, but I noticed a major difference between the entries before March 23rd and those after that date. While we were still in the U.S., there were gaps in the record, days and perhaps a week or so when nothing was worth noting. In Brazil, no page was left blank, and most of the pages were completely filled in, margin to margin. The days were often long and exhausting, but the last thing every night was to record the events of the day, no matter how tired I was. Everything was new and different and needed to be recorded. Even so, many details were not included in my journal. I found them in the almost weekly letters Abby and I wrote to our parents. After my mother passed away in 2019, I ended up with bundles of letters we had written and that she had carefully saved. She saved every letter we wrote her from the mission field in Brazil and Portugal. In the last 9 months of 1972 alone, there were 23 letters that provided another perspective of what we were going through. For simplicity's sake, I'm breaking the story of Brazil into calendar years, although life doesn't fall neatly into the divisions on a calendar. As a start, the rest of 1972 was our first 9 months in a foreign country. The only times we had ever been outside the U.S. was a week in British Columbia, Canada, and a couple of hours across the border at Tijuana, Mexico. In neither case did the local language pose a problem. We handled the Canadian English quite well, I think, and our brief foray into Mexico wasn't long enough to make a blip on the radar screen. Looking back, those first 9 months in Brazil were something of a gestation period for us as missionaries. We had to develop far enough along that we could breathe on our own. There was still a lot of growing and learning ahead of us, but we were not in an incubator. By the end of the year, we were a bouncing baby missionary family, equipped to deal with our new surroundings. So here we are in Brazil. What was different? Well, actually, what wasn't different? Let's just start with the things that made the greatest impression on us that first month. The first view of our new homeland was from the air as we approached the landing in Rio de Janeiro. The earth was red, and so were the tile roofs of the low buildings. The trees were dark green and tropical, an indication we weren't in Chicago anymore. That should have prepared me for stepping out of the plane. When we left Chicago, the temperature was in the 20s in Fahrenheit. And when we arrived in Rio de Janeiro the next day, the temperature was in the 30s Celsius. We had gone from below freezing, around 24 degrees Fahrenheit or -5 Celsius, to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 Celsius in 24 hours. I had boarded the plane in Chicago, quadruple layered for the freezing weather. Undershirt, long sleeve shirt, vest, double knit coat. Double knit was all the rage back then. When we got off the plane in Rio, I was wearing a suit and tie and going into a sauna. And it wasn't just me. There was no air conditioning in the airport. And we went there first to immigration. 4 or 5 immigration officers sat behind a long table with no booths or windows. My, how times have changed, and so have security measures. My first image on the ground in Brazil was that of one of the officers seated at the table, fanning himself with his tie. I used a sheaf of forms to fan myself with, or I'd have used my double knit tie too. And now, 50 years later, the tastes and smells of this new country still linger in our memory. We had a 3-hour layover in Rio de Janeiro before catching our ongoing hour-long flight to São Paulo. And there, missionary colleagues had been waiting for us for a long time. Our flight arrived 7 hours behind schedule. On the ground in Rio, we waited for our flight in the only air-conditioned space of the airport, the restaurant. And there we got our first taste of Brazil. A Brazilian lady traveling with her children from Chicago to São Paulo saw this young couple with 2 small children, 3 and 4 years old, and realized we had no clue what we were doing. She befriended us and suggested we try Guaraná on the drink menu. I looked at the label and then hesitated. Sem álcool. I knew hardly anything in Portuguese, but I didn't need a language course to figure out what alcohol meant. It was just like the English word, except it didn't have an H in it. I knew enough Portuguese that I could pronounce the first word, S-E-M, sem, but I didn't know what it meant. The lady saw my reaction and explained that sem means without. One more Portuguese word added to my miniature active vocabulary. So we tried the carbonated Guaraná drink for the first time. A taste I described in my journal as being a cross between cider and ginger ale. Guaraná is a berry and juices are made from it as well, but the carbonated drink is probably the most common and popular. And it was in that restaurant that we were introduced to the smell of Brazilian meat being fried for steak sandwiches. I can't describe it, and I don't know if it's the meat itself or the oil and any seasoning it's fried in, but I'll recognize it if I ever come across it again. And a short time later, on the connecting flight to São Paulo, we had our first taste of Brazilian coffee. The stewardess brought us tiny Demitasse cups and poured the coffee from a normal thermos. 2 things struck me immediately. The coffee was lukewarm, and it was sweet. Disgustingly so to me, who had always drunk coffee black without sugar. It was almost a syrup. We discovered that Brazilians love to use sugar. After all, it's a major national product. The small town we ended up living in was surrounded by sugarcane plantations. And in the summer, we watched the smoke rise from the fires that were set to burn the leaves from the sugar cane before the stalks were cut and sent to the sugar mills. One time when I was traveling, I stopped at a service station and ordered a coffee. The waitress set a glass on the counter and continued down the counter serving others, giving me time to put sugar in my glass. As she came back along, pouring coffee brewed through a sock filter into our glasses, she went to pour coffee in my glass, and she suddenly stopped short and looked at me with a confused expression. She saw my glass had no sugar in it, and she didn't know what to do. I almost had to pull a gun on her to get her to pour coffee in a glass without sugar. Years later, in Madeira, we teased one of the members of our church who was from Brazil. We watched and counted the number of spoons of sugar he put in his little espresso coffee cup. At our potluck dinners at church, we knew the desserts that were brought by Brazilian members would be super sweet. And speaking of lasting impressions, there was the smell of the floor wax at the Ross's house in São Paulo, where we stayed for most of the first month before we moved into the house next door to the Montgomery family, 250 miles away in the interior. We stayed with the Rosses whenever we came to São Paulo. We went there to take care of documents or banking business. I don't know what wax was actually used on the parquet and the tile floors, but it was used often, once a week. Even with our eyes closed, our noses told us we were at Don and Betty's house in São Paulo. But our home was not to be in the big metropolis of São Paulo. There was a house waiting for us 250 miles to the west in the small town of Santa Cruz do Rio Pardo, near the border with the state of Paraná. The house had just been fixed up and freshly painted, and all it needed was everything else.